So today I'm going to be talking a bit about muscular control, and I'm going to start that with the first part of muscular control, or how the nervous system impacts the musculoskeletal system. And that begins with uncovering the myosin binding sites. So in order for muscular contraction to begin, we have to have the regulatory protein tropomyosin, which usually covers the binding sites, to be moved away from the binding sites. And what does this is the troponin complex, which is a set of regulatory proteins similar to the regulatory protein tropomyosin, which takes the tropomyosin and moves it away from the myosin binding site, allowing for myosin to come in and bind. Now, but before the troponin complex moves tropomyosin away from the myosin binding sites, there needs to be a fundamental step, which is the presence of calcium ions in the area. So calcium ions have to enter in through the cytosol, and in the presence of calcium ions, we see tropomyosin getting moved away from the binding sites. And so ultimately, the presence of calcium ions drives the contraction of the muscle fiber. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the stimulus that occurs even before calcium ions enter the cytosol. So this is kind of relating more to the nervous system side of muscular skeleton operations and less to the workings inside the muscle cells. Now, before calcium ions can enter, the stimulus has to occur. And in this stimulus, we see the synaptic terminal of a motor neuron. And a motor neuron is just a neuron associated with or controlling muscle-related processes. And this synaptic terminal releases acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. And this neurotransmitter depolarizes the muscle fiber and produces an action potential, which is very important because all of muscle contraction and everything I'm going to be talking about ultimately begins with action potentials. Now, this action potential spreads along the folds of the plasma membrane, and these folds are called transverse tubules, and opens calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is a specialized endoplasmic reticulum that is found specifically in muscle cells. And at the end, we see that the opening of calcium channels caused by this action potential means that calcium ions can now pass into the cytosol of the muscle cell. This results in what I discussed previously, in which the calcium ions bind to the troponin complex, and the troponin complex it undergoes conformational change and then moves tropomyosin away from the myosin binding sites and initiates contraction. So what happens when something in the musculoskeletal system goes wrong? That's when you have diseases. And there are a few different diseases that stem from degeneration in muscular processes and systems. One of these is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, involving the degeneration of the brainstem and spinal cord, and the muscle fibers corresponding to them. It is a very damaging and degrading disease, and usually results in paralysis and possibly death within 5 years of the original symptoms. And another disease which isn't as damaging is botulism, and this is caused by a foodborne exotoxin, a bacterial exotoxin called Clostridium botulinum. And it's funny because that exotoxin is actually used in Botox surgeries today, so doctors are using something that is found in diseases to actually alleviate wrinkles and frown lines and Botox treatments. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit more about the neural control of muscle systems, so going back to the nervous system. Now, the nervous system, as I've already talked about, plays a very important role in the functioning of motor mechanisms. Now, there's various levels or hierarchies to this system, starting out with a motor unit. So a motor unit is made up of a motor neuron, which controls a number of different muscle filaments, which are the fibers that make up a muscle. Now, a single motor neuron can synapse, which means sending signals, can synapse to many different muscle filaments. However, hundreds of motor neurons are needed to control an entire muscle. So when the brain wants to carry out a task, for example, when your brain thinks, okay, I'm going to move my arm or I'm going to move my finger, it sizes up the task and thinks about how many different motor neurons are going to be needed for the muscle contraction involved. And of course, the number of motor neurons that are recruited depends on the size of the task. For example, let's say flexing your index finger, or not really flexing, but just moving it a little bit, isn't going to require that many muscle filaments to contract versus flexing your bicep muscle. So the brain sizes up a task and changes the number of fibers that are being recruited based on its evaluation of what it needs to do. Now, an interesting predicament is what happens in postural or support muscles. So these are the muscles that are holding us up and are constantly engaged whenever we're standing or walking or running or whatever. Even when we're sitting, these muscles are contracted. So how does the brain and how does the nervous system and musculoskeletal system in general regulate the contraction of those muscles? Well, what happens is that the nervous system tries to preserve energy by actually alternating between different muscle fibers, between different motor neurons or motor units. And what this does is it tries to alleviate stress placed on a single motor unit by switching between them, and therefore tries to get rid of fatigue overall. Another method for varying the intensity of muscle contraction is by changing up the rate of action potentials being produced. So a single action potential is very short, it's about 1/10 of a second or 100 milliseconds, and it's called a twitch because it's so quick. It's just a momentary muscle contraction. And if you have a series of twitches, it's kind of like this choppy, chaotic movement of or progression of muscle contractions, and it's not very helpful for doing anything. But once you take those action potentials and line them up really quickly, so a rapid fire volley of muscle contractions, of action potentials, you create something called tetanus. And tetanus is very important. It's a very important concept, so you should remember that. But what tetanus requires is a high concentration of calcium ions in order to maintain that peak level of efficiency. Okay, I think we're now done with the hardest part of this section of muscular control, which to me is all the stuff related to the nervous system because it gets a little confusing. So now we're going to go into more basic stuff. So what are the different types of muscle fibers? Well, you have oxidative, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic fibers. And let's talk about the speed fibers first. Well, you have slow and fast. Now, fast fibers perform very quick volleys of twitches. As their name suggests, they're fast, so they're doing prolonged movements of muscle contractions. Now, slow fibers have slower calcium pumps, and so there's less calcium ions in their cytosols, and therefore they're not able to carry out those contractions as quickly. So overall it's less powerful, and however, it's more efficient. It's more energy efficient. Now, there's muscle fibers, in addition to being categorized by their speed, are also categorized by their method of producing ATP. Oxidative fibers use aerobic respiration for producing ATP. So they have much more mitochondria and myoglobin because mitochondria is important for aerobic respiration, and myoglobin is used to pull oxygen out from blood. So it effectively separates oxygen and the rest of blood. And that means that oxidative fibers have a more reddish or pinkish coloration. The other type of fiber, in terms of method of producing ATP, is glycolytic fibers. And these fibers use glycolysis, resulting in less mitochondria and thicker fibers. It also means that they fatigue quicker, and they have an overall white coloration. Now, if you're talking about the fastest muscle contractions out of all three different types, because you have the slow oxidative, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic, glycolytic is by far the fastest. And here's a chart just showing the contrast between the three types of fibers, and I'll leave that up for a while so you can just see it. Okay, almost done. One last thing. So I've talked about, for pretty much the entire time, I've talked about vertebrate skeletal muscle, but it's important to know that there are other types of muscle. And these different types of muscles should be detailed in the previous segment, which is the muscular system, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit here because it's important in muscular control as well. So first you have cardiac muscle, which, as its name suggests, is the type of muscle associated with the heart, and it's only found in vertebrate hearts. Like skeletal muscle, it's striated. However, it consists of self-contained ion channels in the plasma membrane. These channels trigger long action potentials, much longer than the 100 millisecond action potentials you see in skeletal muscles because it's the beating of the heart, so it's going to be much longer. Now, what's really cool about cardiac muscle is that these action potentials are actually synchronized. So once you couple the different types of action potentials with something called intercalated discs, cardiac muscle can pretty much synchronize all action potentials and create synchronized muscle contractions. So that's why your heart beats at the same time. It's not one part of the heart beating at one time, then another part beating maybe a couple milliseconds later. Everything happens at the same time because you have this electrical impulse circulating around the heart and activating all of the muscle cells. Now, what are intercalated discs? Well, they're sites of interlocking for plasma membranes. So you have different plasma membranes connecting up together to create the synchronized muscle contraction. So that's pretty cool. So in addition to cardiac muscle, and of course skeletal muscle, there's also smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is the type of muscle you'll find in the walls of digestive organs or even blood vessels. So it consists of thick filaments scattered around the cytoplasm and then thin filaments attached to dense bodies. So what are dense bodies? Well, they're pretty much round and sort of shapeless, so amorphous, electron-dense areas. So areas in the cell, in the cytoplasm, that don't have much of a shape and have concentrated amounts of electrons, high concentrations. There isn't much myosin in smooth muscle, and myosin doesn't play a very important role. It's not associated with specific fibers. There's also no troponin complex or T-tubules. Action potentials occur as the calcium ions enter the cytosol, just like skeletal muscle, but after that it's a little different. They bind to a protein called calmodulin, and this causes phosphorylation of the myosin head, ultimately resulting in contraction. Now, what about muscles in invertebrates? Because we've been talking about muscles in vertebrates, but of course, vertebrates are only a fraction of the entire animal kingdom, so how do invertebrates do muscular contractions? Well, for the most part, it's not too different. For example, the skeletal muscles in arthropods are pretty much the same as those in vertebrates. The one exception here is insect flight muscles, which deviate a bit because they're designed to produce very quick muscle contractions. Think about an insect that's flexing its wings very quickly as it flies. It's obviously going to need to have much, much quicker contractions than 100 milliseconds. So that's why they're designed to produce action potentials that for much quicker, and I guess probably less energy efficient, but that's how they're able to sustain flight. And then finally, bivalves such as clams or mussels are able to remain closed for so long, and that closing state is really because there are muscles that are contracted. It's not just like they've managed to remain in that state for a month or something. It's because there's actually muscles that are contracted. That contraction occurs because of a special protein called paramyosin, which allows that clam to do these long endurance contractions. Much quicker than our muscles would ever remain contracted. So I think I've gone over everything, and I hope that's helpful, but if it's not, make sure you go back to the website, look at the subpage, and if you're feeling confident, try out the interactive quiz on our review section. And yeah, I hope that was helpful, and I tried my best. I probably was a little disjointed at times, but thanks for listening.